Good morning and welcome to everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us on what I hope will be an informative and useful session. Hopefully you're settled with your morning brew. We've got half an hour, so hopefully we won't fly through too quickly, but we do have Q&A. So if you've got questions that pop up throughout, then do please pop those into the Q&A chat. So I just want to take a moment to welcome our guest speaker, Robbie Richmond, Managing Director of EasySAM. So Bechtle have worked with EasySAM for over 5 years here in the UK now, and we've just really learnt to value their experience and guidance in the world of software asset management. Robbie will be leading this webinar shortly, and we'll take you through the agenda topics. As I say, we have Q&A for those that don't know how to use Q&A. It's up at the top here. So before we kick off and I hand over to Robbie, I just wanted to start with a quick why we're here summary to set the scene for today's topic. So at Bechtle, we've noticed an upward shift in the cadence of vendor software audits since the start of this year. It seems that a 2-year pandemic led to a quiet audit record in the UK market. And now that that time is behind us, vendors and the BSA are ramping up activity with customers. So we currently have customers working through audits with Adobe and Autodesk, both vendor-led and BSA engaged. And we're expecting Microsoft and others to come to the table as periods such as Microsoft NCE and end of fiscal year approach. And these vendor engagements can result in challenges for an organisation as they tend to require a quick turnaround and high investment of resource, let alone the stress and of data collection and remediation. So we hope that this brief webinar will offer you an insight to the audit process and provide an opportunity for your business to consider your approach with becoming audit ready. So I will now hand over to Robbie to guide us through this topic. So over to you, Robbie.
Thanks, Zoe. Morning, everybody. So our, as always outlined, we're also seeing a considerable uplift in the number of software vendors engaging in audits, and we thought this might be a useful opportunity to talk about why that's happening, what are some of the steps that you can put in place to either avoid getting audited, or if you are going to be involved in an audit, to sort of help you to navigate that in the most sort of positive way for your organization. So the first question we need to ask is, why do software vendors do audit, and why do they conduct audits? Well, there's some fairly obvious reasons when we look at some of the statistics that exist in the UK and globally. So these statistics on the screen we're taking from the BSA Global Survey, software survey in 2018. They normally do it every couple of years, but it was the last one was cancelled because of the pandemic, so we expect one probably again later this year. In the UK corporate market, so corporate public sector, education, those sort of markets, as opposed to consumer home use, there is a 21% unlicensed software usage rate. So basically, out of every 5 pieces of software that a typical organization use, one of those pieces of software they haven't paid for. And if you're a software vendor, that obviously represents a significant amount of money that you're leaving on the table at the end of each year. And to put a value on that, that's just in the UK, that's about $1.4 billion just for the UK market. If you expand that globally, the percentage is actually quite a bit higher. It's about 37%. Globally, in fact, the UK is actually one of the better markets in terms of low software piracy and unlicensed software rates. The US is actually the lowest. Some of the probably more developed countries tend to do a bit better. So, Europe, Northern America, those sort of areas tend to do a bit, have considerably lower piracy rates. If you go to some developing countries, those rates can be up in the 60s, 70s and 80s in terms of percentages. And that 37% globally as an average, that represents about $46 billion worth of software that's used and is unlicensed. So from a software vendor perspective, there's real motivation for them to be able to instigate these software audits. The other point to highlight is that software vendors, they get a really high return, or they expect a really high return on an audit. So a typical audit maybe cost a software vendor something like 30 or 40,000 pounds in the UK, but they can expect, or typically they expect about 20 times a return on that. So if an audit's going to cost them, say, 40,000 pounds, they're expecting about an 800,000 pounds return. And we've been involved and worked with customers and software vendors where those numbers have actually been considerably higher. The largest return I've been involved in was a £32,000 audit that resulted in just over 9 million in licensing revenue, which was to Microsoft. So we can understand from this the motivation for software vendors to conduct these audits. Purely from a commercial point of view, it makes a significant amount of sense for them. What are the things that trigger an audit? Why might a software vendor pick on your organization? Well, sometimes it is just your turn. It's a process that software vendors go through where they will look at their customer base and pick customers at random. And if that's the case, there's not really a huge amount we can do for that. But there are some things that we can do, or there are some things that we do, or things that we experience that might increase or will increase the likelihood of us doing being the subject of a software audit. So a change in IT infrastructure, if we're moving from on-prem to cloud or SaaS, if we are consolidating data centers, if we are changing some of the platforms that we use, significant changes in infrastructure, that will result in a change in buying patterns for a software vendor, and that can result in that software vendor looking in a bit more detail at our environment and our usage. A really good example of that, a few years ago, a lot of organizations wanted to migrate from Microsoft to things like Google as a document management platform, and that triggered a whole load of Microsoft audits, as you might expect. Company growth, if an organization's annual accounts show that they've grown significantly, but from a software vendor perspective, they haven't seen an increase in spend or in what they've purchased to support that infrastructure, that might also trigger an audit. And I can tell you for a fact that the audit and SAM and account management guys at some of the software vendors, they are looking at things like company reports, annual reports, that sort of thing. Mergers and acquisitions is an obvious target. If you're acquiring another business or two businesses are merging together, that creates a significant amount of uncertainty, and that uncertainty creates an opportunity for software vendors. It gives them a good justification to come in and do an audit. And bear in mind that those statistics I gave you earlier on, the 21% of software that's unlicensed in the UK, that software vendors looking for an excuse to come in and to look for that 21% of software. So a merger and acquisition is a really good justification for them to do that, and one of the more common ones. Agreement expiration, if you're coming up to the end of an EA or the end of some other subscription or some other agreement that you've got a couple of months ahead of that, particularly if it looks like you're going to renew at the same level or maybe even on a reduced basis, that might be a trigger for a software vendor. And we tend to see, for example, if we use Microsoft as the example, we tend to see audit activity start to ramp up now ahead of their June year end, because audits take a period of time to go through. So we do typically see audit activity start to ramp up in October, so that those activities are completed by, say, sort of February, March, April time, so that the renewals can be done exactly as they should be. Not meeting agreement obligations, if we made a commitment to a vendor that we're going to make a certain amount of spend or buy a certain amount of licenses or commit to a certain amount of software with that vendor, not meeting that might be a good reason for them to come in and do a review and try and bump up that spend. We still see silly things like customers contacting a vendor and asking for support on a product that the customer doesn't have licenses for, particularly if the culture of the organization is quite relaxed about unlicensed software. There might be a perception that actually that software is valid, and so therefore we might contact a vendor and ask for support, and that can trigger, certainly be one of the triggers for a license review. If we decide to terminate support or subscriptions, but maybe we're going to continue using that software, if a software vendor sees that as a change of habit, that could be a trigger. And one that we're seeing a lot over the last few years is where a software publisher gets acquired by another organization. we've had that with a number of different organizations. Most notably, we see that with Oracle around things like Java, for instance. Oracle acquired the rights to Java. Now they're conducting a significant number of audits to try and enforce their intellectual property rights. One of the ones that I didn't put on this list, but I think it is important to be aware of, is whistleblowing. Whistleblowing isn't so prevalent in the UK, but if you go to places like the US, for instance, I was in New York probably about 7 or 8 years ago, and traveling on the metro, I saw an advert up on the side of the metro, which basically said, would you like a free holiday? And I thought, oh, got my interest. And underneath it was basically from the BSA saying, if you report software non-compliance within your organization, you can get a reward of up to $10,000, which you could use for a holiday. I thought it was an interesting approach. We don't see that in the UK per se, but there certainly will be situations where a disgruntled ex-employee or maybe somebody who doesn't feel valued or whatever might actually go to some of these organizations like the BSA, the Federation Against Software Theft, and log a complaint or an issue for a particular organization, which can then trigger an audit. It's not as prevalent in the UK, much more so in the US, but a useful thing for you to be aware of, I think. So what does the audit process look like? Well, first of all, it's a formal process, so it has to follow some standardized kind of rules. So the first thing is you have to be notified in writing. If you get a phone call saying we'd like to come in and audit, ask for it in writing so that you're able to then sort of take it on and respond appropriately. If you do get one of these letters through or notification through, you want to make sure that you involve your legal teams as well as senior management as soon as possible. Don't ignore the letter. You do want to make sure that you respond to it. However, I say that there are some circumstances where an organization might be written to by a software vendor, but it's not classed as a formal audit. So we've had this with some vendors in the past where they will write to you and say something like, we want you to self-audit or self-certify, and they'll give you some spaces to fill in, how many installations you have of different pieces of software. That's a different process to an audit. An audit is a legal requirement that you've agreed to as part of your end user license agreement or part of your volume agreement or contract. The second example where they write to you and say, can you please fill this in, that's effectively a phishing exercise. So we can ignore the second type. We can't ignore the first type. So get your legal teams involved as soon as possible so that you're able to identify which of the two you're dealing with. Once you've got the formal notification, you need to acknowledge the letter and you need to get a non-disclosure agreement in place as soon as possible. This is primarily to protect you in the event that there is a licensing shortfall. You don't want that software vendor going out to the public and saying, we've just done an audit of this company over here and we found them to have a license shortfall, because that could affect your brand, it could affect your share price, it could affect people's jobs, which we have seen before. So get that non-disclosure agreement in place as soon as possible. That will then progress into an initial kind of conversation where you look at what's the scope, the timescales, etc. And remember that this is all a negotiation. This is not, the software vendor will say to you, we want this by this, by this, by this. You're able to respond to that. You're able to, to ask for, reasonable concessions, reasonable timescales, scope, all that kind of stuff is all open to negotiation. So typically a software vendor might write to you and say, we want this information in the next 10 days. You're not actually under any legal obligation to provide it within that time frame. What you can do is go back and say, actually, we need, 3 months to do this, or 2 months, or whatever is appropriate. I mentioned scope on here, and I'll mention this again a little bit later on because this is really important. It's really, really crucial that you identify exactly what the scope is of the audit. What environments are you talking about? What products are you looking for? What geographies are you looking to cover? If you've got subsidiaries, are they included or are they not included? And the reason why that's important is because you want to narrow down that scope as much as possible to make that audit as painless as possible. I say painless, audits are never painless, but to reduce the amount of impact of that audit. So if a software company says we want to come in and do an audit, restrict it down as much as you possibly can. What environments, what geographies, and what products are they specifically looking for? That will then move on to a data gathering exercise. Typically, this is done by a third party. Very rarely do software vendors have their own data gathering guys. They tend to use third parties. Most commonly, they'll use some of the sort of big audit companies, so KPMG, PwC, etc. Sometimes they'll use smaller, kind of more specialist organizations, but generally it tends to be these sort of larger audit companies. And what they'll do is they'll provide you with some scripts or some command line activities that they want you to run, and they'll expect you to go off and do that. They don't actually do that kind of physical work themselves. So this is where it starts to get a bit disruptive, but also one of the really important points here is to look at what data these tools are gathering. If you're being audited by Oracle, the only requirement you have is to provide data on Oracle environments. So you'll find that some of these scripts, they'll gather data on your SQL environment, your virtualization platforms, other line of business applications. Oracle have no right to that information. They only have right to the information that relates to their platform or their product set. So look at these scripts. What you'll often find is the scripts go off and they'll pull back information on everything that's installed on a server or a desktop. The vast majority of that is none of that vendor's business, and you want to make sure that you're not providing them with free information, which they might use for other purposes. Make sure that you're restricting that down to the topics that are covered in the audit and the products that are covered in the audit. And then the last step is to validate the data. Don't just accept what the third party says. Make your own checks, make sure you're happy that it's an accurate reflection of your environment. And, if you don't feel that it is, take the time to challenge that output, because ultimately what's going to happen next is you're going to end up with a settlement, and that settlement's going to be based on the output of that data. So you want to make sure that you've restricted that down, that it's as clear and as accurate as possible. And the reason why I use this image for the slide is that most people think, oh, if I've got a licensing shortfall, I just have to pay for that license going forward. Unfortunately, that's typically not what happens. What will happen with particularly some of the more militant vendors is they'll make you pay for historic usage. They'll make you pay an amount as a penalty, and then you also have to buy the software to be able to use it going forward. So actually, the license cost going forward is actually just a small amount of the total amount of the settlement. The other thing that vendors will do is they'll use this settlement discussion as a way of driving the behavior or the purchasing agreements that they want, which isn't necessarily what you want. So we see a lot of people who, for example, if they've got a Microsoft shortfall, they're being pushed down the Azure route or Office 365 route, for instance, which might not be what they wanted to do. I'm sure for most people it probably is, but on occasion we do see that being used to sort of drive a particular sort of behavior. So what are the things we can do to minimize that impact? Well, the first thing is to get as many people as we can in our organization involved as early as possible. Legal, get security involved if we're going to run scripts, get procurement involved so that we can gather all of our entitlement data and do that as quickly as possible. I've already outlined about scope. Make sure that we understand exactly what the scope is and restrict it as much as possible. That's going to reduce the amount of impact. Timescales, as I said, vendors will always push a short timescale, but that might not work for your business. I know of retail organizations that have been asked to conduct an audit in December, for instance, which is their busiest period of the year. It's perfectly reasonable for those organizations to say, actually, running an audit right now would threaten our business and would threaten the stability of our environment, so we're not prepared to do that. We'll push it back. January might equally be busy with January sales, so we'll start in February. It's a perfectly reasonable position to take, and one that software vendors pretty much will accommodate. Make sure you validate the data. One of the most common things that we see is that when these organizations like KPMG and PwC come in and do an audit, they're paid a fixed amount for the audit. So what tends to happen is they tend to be a little bit lazy in terms of how much detail they go down into. So they'll make assumptions which are just kind of quite superficial and as I said, quite lazy. You might find that you're able to show, well, actually, when we bought that piece of software, we were allowed to do this, or we have these rights from this agreement, and the auditor might not necessarily take the time to look at that. So make sure that you take the time to validate the results yourself. Don't just assume because they're a vendor appointed auditor that they're going to get it right. And then negotiate. When you sit down with the vendor, they will say to you, this is the licensing shortfall, this is what you have to spend. That's the start of a conversation, because you don't want to just necessarily out of hat spend that amount of money. In some cases that could be a significant amount of money and might affect other things that you as a business want to do. It might also affect your relationship with that vendor. So vendors, it's a starting point, and you can then start to have a conversation about, well, what if we do this? What if we agree this level of spend for the next 3 years, or whatever it might be? It's a negotiation starting point, really. So don't just take it as a as hard coded. It's one that we can actually negotiate with that vendor. And then finally, in terms of my piece, is around being ready for an audit. What are the things that you can do as an organization so that if you do get audited, you're ready? Well, the first thing, and one of the easiest things to do, is to make sure that you keep a good line of communication open with your vendor. If you're looking at making changes to your environment or your infrastructure, tell them about it and tell them what you're doing. If your organization is growing, when you have your next review with that account manager, explain that to them and explain what your plans are, and that makes it less likely that these things will be used as triggers for an audit. Carry out your own audits. Don't wait for that letter to come through. And to be honest, this is a good practice anyway. We should be looking at our own licensing position on a regular basis. We tend to use it maybe a couple of months ahead of a true up or a renewal, and that's not a bad time to do it. But we don't have to wait for that. We can maintain accurate audit compliance and license compliance pictures ourselves. Document our ownership. Make sure that we can identify very easily what software we've got, where it's come from, and what entitlement that gives us. If you need some help, there are audit and SAM partners like ourselves out there that we can help. We've got a lot of experience in doing that. Don't just rely on your own experience for that. You can use third parties to help you with that, and that can be quite valuable and quite rewarding in terms of reducing licensing spend and settlement figures for this process. And then finally, look at software asset management. So software asset management is something that helps you by tracking what you own, where it is, how it's being used, and flagging up where there are sort of gaps and licensing shortfalls, so that you can deal with those ahead of getting audited. My favorite part of our job, or my favorite part of my job, is when a customer of ours receives an audit letter, and we invite the partner, the software vendor, to come in, and we show them exactly what entitlement that customer has, what software they've got deployed, where it is, how it's being used. Typically, that's the end of the audit, because an audit costs software vendors money. And if we can show that actually there's no likelihood of a significant return within that customer, the chances are that the audit won't go ahead. And that's, ultimately, that's the kind of goal that we want to get to. With that, I'm going to hand back over to Zoe. If anybody does have any questions, please use the Q&A section, which is just on the top of the screen. Ask any questions, and we'll come back to those at the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Robbie. Whirlwind tour, I think, through audit preparation, but hopefully you found that to be useful, and perhaps this will kind of start the journey off within your organisation to either achieving, say, SAM maturity, or provide some guidance on the most effective ways to prepare for a vendor audit and reduce the stress that surrounds these engagements. So Bechtle are here to support in any number of ways. For those of you that have worked with us over the years, you should be familiar with kind of the service portfolio that we have available. We're here to help in any capacity, whether that's having a discussion with yourself to just go back through some of those points that Robbie's raised, and give you a little bit of guidance on how to maybe get some insight and visibility into your own environment. Or if we need to take that step further, we've got services and solutions that we've built that can be adapted based on your requirements. So we have an audit readiness assessment that can be tailored to suit perhaps a single vendor or multiple vendor review, and we can deliver that as either proactive, so as Robbie was saying, that be prepared aspect, or as a reactive engagement. So following that point when you've maybe received a letter from a software publisher and you want some additional support, we can become involved at that stage and tailor an engagement to kind of suit what the requirements are of that particular letter of engagement. From there, we can go through different aspects where we support you to work towards SAM maturity. So managed services support. It could be reviewing your current SAM tools or processes, through to delivering SAM-based training to your teams to equip you with running a strong SAM-based practice. So if you're interested in any of those services that we have available, do reach out to your account managers, reach out to myself, and we can kind of guide you through some of that portfolio. But as a next kind of step, we are looking to run a SAM roundtable workshop early next year, where we'll explore this and other subjects in greater depth, providing an opportunity for sharing some insights and some best practice. So more information on that will be announced in the coming weeks. So do keep an eye on our communications from myself and from your account manager. So I guess once again, I just want to thank you for your time today. As I said, do reach out to us if this is a topic that you want to discuss further. And many thanks to Robbie and Tanya for joining us today and taking us through that journey. I'll leave you to get on with your Tuesdays. Thank you very much, and hopefully we'll speak to you all soon. All the best.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye all.